Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar on sharing personal information and working from home. I'm Alan Stokes, one of the policy leads at SFHA. We're delighted to have with us Daradjeet Jagpal from Information Law to talk us through this subject. I'm sure you'll have plenty of questions, and Microsoft Teams has a function for you to type these in. If you click on the question tab at the top right of your screen, you can type in your question and we'll put that to Daradjeet. The session will be recorded and made available on the SFHA website afterwards. And with that, I'll hand you over to Daradjeet.
Thank you, Alan. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to take you through sharing personal information and also looking at homeworking as well. I will just share my screen. Okay, sorry about that. You should now see the slide presentation for COVID-19 and the GDPR, data sharing and homeworking. I'm going to take you through three key areas today. The first is going to be data sharing with contractors and also data sharing with the SHR, which has been quite a topical issue for RSLs recently. Another one which we're all faced with at the moment is homeworking and data security, which I'll be looking at second. And while the title doesn't really suggest this and lend itself to this, I'm going to finish off very briefly with a look at freedom of information and the Coronavirus Scotland Act 2020, which I'm sure you'll be aware of. As part of that, I'll be looking at various changes that have been made, temporary changes that have been made to freedom of information legislation in Scotland. As Alan said, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them as we go through. And what we will do is I'll answer them there and then, as opposed to at the end, just in case there's anything that you'd like more clarity on as we go through. So beginning with data sharing with contractors and the SHR, what I'm really talking about here when I'm talking about data sharing is the sharing of sensitive personal data with contractors when it comes to the contractors. What a lot of RSLs have experienced recently is having to share information to do with their service users, their coronavirus status, whether an individual is displaying symptoms, whether an individual is shielding or is self-isolating. And contractors are mainly being engaged at the moment to do necessary and urgent repairs and maintenance, and not for your routine regular maintenance. Now, if you're having to tell contractors about information to do with how your service users are, what their coronavirus status is, that naturally brings about GDPR issues. And the question really is well, is that compatible with the GDPR? And we'll have a look at that as part of this section. The second part of the data sharing here that we're going to look at is to do with the SHR. As you'll be aware from the communication that you will have received from the SHR last week, there is a new monthly information return that you're required to complete. And as part of that, you're required to give certain sensitive personal information, or what appears to be certain sensitive personal information to the SHR, which is going to be onward shared with the Scottish Government, and we'll have a look at the legality of that. The one I would spend more time on, though, is the sharing of information with contractors. Now, as I mentioned earlier, what that is to do with where, let's say, you're having an urgent repair carried out, or gas servicing carried out, which is one of the issues that has been mentioned in the SHR and the SFHA website recently, and you're having to tell your contractors or give them some information around the coronavirus status of your service users. In that situation, as I mentioned, the GDPR is triggered. And the key part of the GDPR that's triggered here are the data protection principles, because as you'll be aware, the data protection principles contained within the GDPR are essentially the rules of the road so far as data protection is concerned. All RSLs must comply with the principles. There are certain exceptional circumstances in which you do not need to comply, but otherwise you do need to comply with the principles. Now, there's 4 principles that are mainly engaged here in the data sharing context with contractors. The first is the need to process personal data lawfully, fairly and transparently. I've emboldened the word lawfully here because lawfully is the key requirement. We'll have a look at this on the next slide. But lawfulness is to do with whether you have a legal basis or a legal reason to share sensitive personal information to do with your service users with the contractors in question. The second is, excuse me, to do with processing only adequate and relevant personal data and limiting it to what is necessary for the purposes. Now, what that is to do with is to ensure that the information that you're gathering on your service users and that you're in turn sharing with your contractors and your service providers is limited to absolutely what you need and no more than that. So if you are in gathering information to do with service users' coronavirus status, if you're asking them questions around this before you send contractors in or before contractors send their personnel in, then it's important that you're only collecting information that you absolutely need and you're not going overboard and using that opportunity as perhaps a fishing expedition. Now, that would be very uncharacteristic of an RSL in any case, but it's important to limit it to exactly what you need. And that will be contextual. It will depend on the circumstances at any given moment. So a month ago, for example, RSLs were asking whether someone had been to a coronavirus affected country within the last 14 days. That's no longer relevant now because obviously with travel restrictions and so forth. The fourth principle is also relevant. The numbering I've used here, I should say, is the numbering of the principles as they are in the GDPR. It's not a typo, it's not meant to be 1, 2, 3, 4, but it's 1, 3, 4, and 5. The fourth principle is also relevant here, and that's to ensure that personal data that an RSL holds is accurate and up to date. So the coronavirus is fortunately one of these conditions that changes in status. A person, in most cases, should hopefully recover from it. So if you have gathered information on a service user or other members of their household previously to suggest that they were experiencing symptoms, but they are no longer experiencing those symptoms, then it's important to keep that information up to date. So if you collected information last week, it's important that you touch base with the household again to make sure that the information held as at last week's date is still correct and it's still up to date, so that you're not sharing irrelevant information with the and out of date information with the contractor. And number 5 is to do with data retention, not keeping personal data for longer than necessary for the purposes. Right now, we're not quite sure how long the pandemic is going to last, and certainly from last night's news, the indication is that this pandemic will be with us, unfortunately, for some time to come. So my recommendation would be that you retain this information certainly for as long as the pandemic lasts, just so that you have an audit trail and records of why certain disclosures were made at a particular time. It's important to keep that for your own protection. What I'm going to do now is hone in on the lawfulness requirement, because principles 3, 4, and 5 are relatively straightforward to comply with in the contractor context when you're sharing sensitive personal information to do with coronavirus status with them. But lawfulness is a key requirement, which I think can be quite tricky to comply with. And this is where we really need to ensure that we are ticking all the right boxes when it comes to the GDPR. As you may be aware, the lawfulness requirements require you to have what's known as a legal basis in the GDPR before you can share personal data with the contractors. Now, the legal bases are split up between what you need for personal data and what you need for sensitive personal data. And I've used 2 columns on this slide here to indicate the different legal bases. I've been referring to health, coronavirus related information is sensitive. The technical term in the GDPR is special category personal data, but sensitive is essentially the old school Data Protection Act 1998 wording, but the two are essentially interchangeable. So on the left hand side we have the column for personal data, and on the right we have for special category or sensitive. Now, if we're sharing coronavirus related information, health condition related information with our contractors, that sharing has to tick one option from the first column and one option from the second column. Now, this can be quite a tricky task to do in practice, but hopefully what I've done in this slide is to give you a variety of options around the legal basis that you can use. So let's have a look at what they are. The first is consent. If you are able to get the consent of the service user to the sharing of their coronavirus related information or personal data with a contractor, then that's all well and good. That would be a valid legal basis for you to share. The same would apply in the case of their household members. If you were sharing information to do with household members with a contractor, then again, if you were able to get their consent, that would be fine. Now, the only thing you need to be careful about with household members, though, is that consent has an age requirement. There is an age of capacity in data protection law. In Scotland, that age of capacity is 12. So as long as a person is of age 12 and above, they're presumed to have a capacity to consent and to say yes in data protection law. I would probably not recommend going for consent though. My reasoning behind that is that consent is quite difficult to get in data protection law, particularly when you're sharing sensitive personal data, because in the first column we have consent, but in the second column we have the requirement for explicit consent. And explicit consent has to be very clear and specific consent where a person understands the full consequences of saying yes, and it can't be forced. And my concern would be that if you were sharing health-related information to do with a service user or a member of their household with a contractor who is going in to do repairs or maintenance, then in that scenario, the consent may not necessarily be completely voluntary. Because if a person has, let's say, a sink blocked and they need someone to come in to fix it, they're going to say yes to that information being shared with the contractor. They don't really have an option to say no. And I would really put a question mark on whether that consent was fully GDPR compliant. But that's not to say that if we don't get consent, we don't have other options. I've listed the others here. For regular data, for the regular side of the personal data sharing here, you have contract. Now, obviously, with all your service users, you have an agreement in place, be it your tenants or your factored owners, if you engage in factoring activities. There is an argument to say that any data sharing that takes place with a contractor is to fulfill your side of the bargain, essentially to fulfill your side of the contract, that it is necessary for the purposes of performing your duties and obligations as their landlord. That might be quite a far-fetched argument, but it's certainly one that you could potentially rely on. The other ones, though, that I've listed here are the ones that I would rely on more than the contractor consent one, to be honest. Legal obligation is a strong one for you. You have a legal obligation to ensure the health and safety of your staff. You have a legal obligation that would extend to ensuring the health and safety of your contractors while they are on your premises, and I suppose premises could be extended to include the properties that you rent out or that you the factor for. So you could say that there is a legal obligation on you to ensure the health and safety of the contractors and therefore share that data. Vital interests appears in both columns, both for personal and for special category, and that possibly is your strongest legal basis for sharing data. And that would apply both for the vital interests of the contractor and for the service user as well. So that is that you would have a legal basis in protecting the vital interests, the health, safety, the well-being of the contractor's staff in sharing that data. Because otherwise you could potentially be sending a contractor's member of staff, or they would be sending a member of staff out to a situation that could potentially be dangerous and harmful to them. So you could rely on vital interests to share the data. And the last one there is legitimate interests. You could argue that you have a legitimate interest, a business interest, or even interest as a landlord to ensure that repairs are carried out timelessly, and the only way to do so and safely, and the only way to do so is to share that sensitive personal data or that special category personal data to do with health. So you'll see from this slide that there are many options available for you, but my advice would be that if you are looking to record the reason why or the legal basis why you're able to share this data, I would rely on vital interest, because that allows you to click both the personal data column and the special category column as well. Consent, I would not rely on. If you do have it, if you have it from your service user and that's the approaches that you have been using so far, then that's fine. But I would record that as being one potential legal basis, but have vital interests and possibly a legal obligation as your backup legal basis, because it's always useful to have more than one legal basis if possible in any data processing scenario. The next side to data sharing that I want to have a look at is the SHR monthly information returns. Certainly a few of our clients, when they received these last week, were slightly concerned that there were some questions asked within the annex to the letter from the regulator around certain particulars of employees. But as you'll see, this presents less of a GDPR issue than sharing data with contractors. The monthly information return is really part of the regulator's reporting to the Scottish Government and the new Social Housing Resilience Group, the SHRG. And the real purpose behind these information returns is to get a clear picture of the impact of the coronavirus on social landlords and their tenants, their service users, and to highlight where support is needed. This information should hopefully provide the government and the SHRG with that national picture, essentially, of what the state of play is. The first return is due very shortly, on the 7th of May, and there's no drop dead date as to when it's going to continue until the regulator says it's until the impact of the pandemic reduces. So I would say certainly for the foreseeable future, this is something you're going to have to do on a month-to-month basis. Once the SHR and the SHRG get this information, the SHR gets this information, it's going to then aggregate that data and then share it with the Scottish Government and the SHRG. And this, based on my understanding, certainly is going to be anonymised aggregate data. It's not going to be on a landlord by landlord basis. One thing that the regulator highlights, though, is that this does not replace the need for you to report notifiable events to the Scottish Housing Regulator. So you still need to report those as and when they arise. This is a separate activity from that, and so it's not to confuse the two. So what is it that perhaps appeared on the radar of data protection people as such? Well, within the annex to that letter, there was a requirement to provide information on staff absence levels on the last day of the month, as in the 30th of April for the current reporting month. And that's the total number of staff that the RSL has. And within the total number of staff, how many members of staff are not available to work, either because of ill health or because they're caring for another person, because of compassionate leave, or for other reasons. And then also providing details of the number of staff placed on furlough as well, in accordance with the UK government furlough scheme. Now, in the face of it, this could appear to be quite concerning because there is some sensitive personal data there, or special category data there, to do with, well, ill health circumstances, or other reasons even could potentially encapsulate sensitive or special category personal data. And there's also other non-sensitive personal data around the number of staff placed on furlough, or those who have care responsibilities or are otherwise absent. My view is, looking at this, is that specific disclosures are not required. And if you go back to what the SHR is looking for, it's total numbers. They're not looking for the specifics. They're not looking for information on a macro level. They're not wanting the names or the job titles, the grades of affected members of staff. And while there, I appreciate for today's webinar, there's a mixture of small, medium and large RSLs. Certainly for the smaller RSLs out there, where you perhaps may have one person per role, I would not be overly concerned by this, because you are providing it at a very high level bird's eye view.
Sorry to interrupt, Daradjeet. We've just had a question in.
Of course,
yeah, it's relating to the grounds for processing. You'd mentioned about legitimate interests, and the questions around whether RSLs can still actually use that because of the Freedom of Information legislation, which removed the right for public bodies to use legitimate interests.
Certainly a valid question, and that would apply. I would say you can use legitimate interests. They are in certain circumstances, and I would say that it would be a very limited one to use. In this scenario, you could argue that the RSLs are engaging in an unusual processing that they would not normally engage in. I mean, ordinarily, RSLs would not hold information on a wholesale basis on their service users' health, for example. There may be certain health-related information that's held as part of the housing application, but on an ongoing basis, you don't gather health information on your service users unless they raise as a concern, like say if they want an adaptation to a property. The legitimate interest ground is only unavailable to public authorities where it's to do with their core functions. So it's not to functions that are an aside to their core functions. They're entitled to use legitimate interest as a legal basis. And my argument here would be is that this processing, while it does form part and parcel of an RSL's duties in terms of repairs, maintenance and so forth, this is an unusual set of circumstances which does not fall within the grand scheme of what is a RSL's core functions. So I would say that legitimate interest would potentially be available here for data processing. But as I say, there's stronger grounds available, particularly vital interest and legal obligations. So legitimate interest could be something that you could record as being a potential ground that's open and available to you, but only in these unusual circumstances.
Thanks, Daradjeet.
Okay. Again, with other reasons, as part of the monthly information return, I'd be very careful not to disclose the reasons for absence. That's not what's required. You can just specify that staff are absent for other reasons. So please do be aware of that. I wouldn't go into the specifics. Once the SHR has the information, as I say, this is going to be reported on aggregated an anonymised basis to the Scottish Government and the SHRG anyway, so there's no need for you to necessarily provide personal information at that macro level. And my argument would be is that going back to the legal basis that we discussed, the legal reasons, there wouldn't actually be a legal basis for you here to provide individualised or named personal data in any case anyway. So taking a step back from this, my argument would be that you're actually not engaging the GDPR here at all if you are providing information on a no-names basis, because the personal data processing is happening within the RSL, but anything that is going out is on a no-names anonymous basis. And the GDPR only applies to named personal data, not to anonymised personal data. So do be aware of that. Okay, so we've looked at sharing of personal data with contractors and with the SHR, and hopefully what you've gleaned from this is that there's no obstruction in your way when it comes to the GDPR. It's not designed to make your life difficult, and certainly this is a message that I've seen coming across from the Information Commissioner's Office, the ICO. Over the last couple of weeks, certainly she's posted a number of blogs and other updates on her website, and it certainly lends itself to a view that the ICO is taking a proportionate approach to data protection regulation, and if an organisation can justify its actions in a particular way, then that's fine. But I would emphasise here that there's an importance to keeping good quality records, because you'll be aware of the accountability requirement in the GDPR, and that's about good quality record keeping. So if you are engaging in any unusual data processing of the nature that I've described around sharing health-related information with contractors, or indeed if you're holding health-related information on contractors, then keep records of this. And if you have an in-house DPO or an external DPO, make sure that any advice that you get is in writing so that you have an audit trail of that advice to protect your best interests in the event that that's subject to challenge. Okay, so on to homeworking and data security. This is something that has featured pretty much anywhere and everywhere on the internet, and it only takes a quick trip onto LinkedIn or any other social media platform to see all sorts of weird and wonderful examples of homeworking. What I've really come across from RSLs that we work with has been a number of different scenarios that they've had and they've used to working with or to working from home. The first is obviously using laptops and mobile devices and getting used to the world of working on a really, really small screen. And these laptops and mobile devices can either be the RSL's own issued to staff or the staff member's own. And this engages considerations of BYOD or bring your own device. There's also issues around remote access to document management systems, and this can be very basic high-level access, or for more advanced document management systems it can be a case of being able to look at the system as you would in the office within your home. And video conferencing has also come up. Certainly I'm aware of staff having daily and weekly team meetings, if you want to call them that, just to go over things as you would in the office. So let's say a housing manager catching up with his or her housing officers and housing assistants on a daily or a weekly basis to see how things are getting on. And there's use of instant messaging, and it's likes of WhatsApp to contact one another to see when would be most convenient to arrange the various video conferencing calls and so forth. And there's tools available for collaborative working that RSLs have been using. I'm aware of RSLs creating groups within Microsoft Teams where colleagues can work on and view files together as well. And I'm not going to comment on suitability or otherwise of these various tools. Each RSL has its own approach to these things. There are various options out there to use, and everyone has their own preferences, and there's risks and benefits of all technologies involved. But what I am going to do is really flag up what the GDPR data security requirements are and what you can do as an organisation to improve your levels of data security. So as a reminder, the GDPR, DPP 6, that's Data Protection Principle 6, states that RSLs must put in place appropriate technical and organisational data security measures to safeguard their personal data. So technical are your systems-based measures and organisational are your physical data security measures that are put in place to safeguard the personal data from various risks like unauthorised access, loss, and so forth. Now I emphasise the word appropriate here, and appropriate is essentially a means-based test, a risk-based test. So the level of data security measures that a large group-based RSL has to take have to be far more significant compared to a smaller community-based RSL, because it is a question of risk ultimately. As part of looking at what's appropriate, you've also to look at the likes of the state of the art, what's available, how much it costs, and naturally if you're a larger RSL you may have bigger budgets when it comes to IT security to be able to afford more advanced data security technologies than a smaller RSL would. And equally, what the personal data is being used for and the risk to the data subjects as well. So if you are an RSL with the inbuilt care function, for example, and you're dealing with the personal data of vulnerable adults, or if you have various community activities involving children who are potentially vulnerable within your local community, then you'll inevitably be dealing with more confidential personal data than perhaps another RSL that doesn't engage in those activities. So you would have to have added security to protect that data. But in the grand scheme of things, it comes down to your own assessment as an organisation of what you think is appropriate based on risk and based on the types of breaches or incidents that you've experienced in the past and what you need to rectify what's happened. What I'm going to set out over the next couple of slides for you are what I regard as being effective risk management measures that you can take as an RSL, sort of general common sense, free of charge things that you can do to protect your personal data. I'm not going to go into specific technologies, and I know from the delegate list from today that there are some individuals who have a technical role within their organisation, and I would defer to your own expertise to look at what you can do in your own organisations. But these are things that I would recommend from a non-technical point of view, and that are easy to do and can help protect your data and reduce the risk of any data security incidents or breaches. The first here is to use two-factor authentication to secure access to your document management systems. What I mean by two-factor authentication is that when you log on, it's not simple or alone enough to have a password, what you need to do is you also then need to insert an additional code or a password that's either texted or emailed to you. So it's like when you log into online banking, if you have two-factor authentication enabled, you put in your username and your password, and then a code will be texted to you that allows you to then log into the account. But unless and until you receive that second factor through text message, you're not able to log in. Now that may be quite difficult to do in practice, but it does offer an added and advanced level of security, and it's certainly a level of security recommended by the National Cyber Security Centre of the UK government. Now it may be that your document management system doesn't support that, but certainly most modern ones do. The next would be not to use your personal email accounts, your personal cloud storage accounts, or any personal apps for your RSL business. Now it may be that it seems quite convenient to use a personal email account because that's the one you always have in your phone, let's say, and for whatever reason your RSL one is not working as well as it normally does when you're working remotely, and it's just not as smooth as it is in the office, and you're experiencing difficulties, or it's easier to put something in the cloud, on your iCloud or in your Dropbox, and share it with colleagues. That's all well and good, but please bear in mind that personal email accounts, cloud storage and free cloud storage accounts, and a lot of apps out there are not particularly secure. I would certainly only ever use apps that are authorised by your RSL, that they have specifically chosen for their staff to use. I would not go out on a whim and use an app that has not been notified to you as being an authorised app. And similarly, I would avoid using ad hoc apps as well. If you're working remotely and you don't have access to, let's say, a PDF conversion software, and you look online and find something that's free and appears easy to use, there could be all sorts of risks attached to that. So I would exercise caution before you use any unauthorised apps on that ad hoc basis. Similarly, if you're using any collaboration tools that your RSL provides, be it Microsoft Teams, be it Google Docs, if you're working on a document together or a report online, I would ensure that if you are engaging in any conversations using that, if you have a chat room facility or whatever it may be, please be careful of what you say and do on that platform, because remember, you are subject to freedom of information now, and you have been for a number of years subject to the environmental information regulations. People can get access to what you say and do, and that includes information that you may type into or share on collaborative platforms as well. So while they may appear informal, and Microsoft Teams may seem like a chat room from the turn of the century at times, it's important to exercise the usual etiquette that you would do when you were engaging in any other RSL professional communications, just because of that risk as well of FOI disclosure, and obviously disclosure in response to subject access requests under the GDPR as well. Sorry,
Daradjeet, we've had a couple of questions.
Perfect.
Yeah, the first one I think is probably more for SFHA than yourself. It's just around the ARC return, or sorry, around the return that the regulator's requesting, and whether it should include subsidiary information as well. And I think my understanding is it's only the parent, but I will double check that, and we'll include something in that in our governance briefing update coming up. But there's another question here just relating to contractors.
Mm-hmm.
And the legal obligation for providing contractors with special category information. Mm-hmm. It's just wondering if relevant HSE legislation would qualify as legal. For example, CDM legislation places an obligation on the provision of all pre-construction health and safety to a contractor prior to them starting work.
Yes, if the legal obligation is very broad, and as long as there is a law out there that requires certain information to be provided for a particular purpose, then that would be sufficiently broad and acceptable here. The GDPR is not designed to get in the way of you complying or not being able to comply with other legislation, and that's why the legal obligation duty is there, so that if you do have a responsibility to comply with another set of rules, then the option is there for you to justify data processing on that basis.
Thanks, Daradjeet.
Okay. So home Wi-Fi routers, if we were doing this in person, one of the questions I would probably have asked you at this point would be to say how many of you have actually bothered to change your password on your home Wi-Fi router. And I would expect the majority of you to not have done so. And I'll be honest, this is something that people don't turn their minds to, but it's something that internet service providers strongly recommend that you do, because when your Wi-Fi router is shipped from your internet service provider or from the manufacturer, it contains a default password, the one that you put in on your device to access the Wi-Fi at home. Now, I would strongly recommend that if you've not done so, I would change the password. The reason being is that these default passwords are widely known, they're widely available on the internet, and if you haven't changed the name of your device or your internet connection, it only takes someone fairly savvy and with a Wi-Fi connected device outside your house to potentially link in to your Wi-Fi connection. Now, I'm not going to go into the technicalities of this because I'm a legal person, not a technical person, but my very basic layperson's understanding here is that it is possible in some circumstances for someone to connect to your Wi-Fi and potentially access data within your home network, depending on how your home network is set up. So that if they're able to distinguish your mobile phone, your laptop, if you have one, a smart TV or whatever else that's connected to your network, they're potentially able to tap into those devices. Now, that may seem quite far-fetched, excuse me, but that is my understanding of how these things operate. So I would strongly recommend that you change passwords, and instructions are available on your internet service provider's website and on the device or the router manufacturer's website as well on how to do this. It also means that you can choose a far more memorable password than the default one, which can sometimes be slightly less so. The next I would recommend is not ever using public Wi-Fi. If you live in an area where public Wi-Fi is available, let's say your internet goes down, as it can do from time to time, I would recommend that you do not connect to free public Wi-Fi as the alternative, as a fallback position. I would strongly recommend that if you're not aware of this already, to understand how tethering works. Tethering is where you use your mobile phone's data connection as essentially almost as a Wi-Fi hotspot, and you can then connect your computer to the mobile phone and share its connection as you would if you were connecting to your home router. So that would be my recommended fallback position, certainly if your home Wi-Fi goes into fail mode. When you're video conferencing, be aware of what can be seen. I would always recommend that you place your camera in a position that personal items that you do not want to share with colleagues or with others are not visible, and you'd be surprised the sorts of things that you can see within a video camera. I mean, if you were able to see me right now with, let's say, boxes of medication sitting behind me to do with a particular medical condition, you could potentially deduce from that I am the one who suffers from that medical condition, and that's sensitive or special category personal data about me being disclosed over video conference without potentially me being aware of it or giving it a second thought. So just be aware of your general surroundings. If there's anything you don't want to share, then put that out of the frame, so to speak. The next is to do with confidentiality of personal data at home. That can be difficult, and the number of people I've phoned over the last few weeks when we've been in lockdown and they've had family members walking around, be it children or others who they live with, and they've had them walking around in the background while I've been on the phone with them. I have had one or two concerns around data security. Certainly, you'll be aware that your contract of employment with your RSL requires you to keep any information, including personal information that you come into contact with, confidential as part of your role. Now, if you're living with others and they are not employed by the RSL that you work for, then it's not a good idea to have papers or other documents lying about. And equally, be aware of your surroundings. If you're working on your computer, your laptop or other device, just be aware of what others can see on your screen, particularly if it's confidential or very confidential or very sensitive information, things that you shouldn't be sharing. It's a good practice, certainly at the end of the day, not only from your own well-being point of view, but from a data security point of view, to lock away papers, documents, and your device once you've finished your working day. That means that it's out of sight and out of mind for others as well as yourself as well, so they're not able to look at papers randomly sitting in your dining room table or your office desk if you happen to have a home office. The next points relate to, I suppose, the next couple relate to if you're using your own device. If you are using your own device, separate your own personal data from the work-related information. So having separate folders on your device where you save documents, and possibly even having files or folders with password-restricted access protects that information, particularly if it's a shared device as well. Because it may be that your laptop is used by you, but it may be used by other household members as well during the day. And the worst would be that you've got a desktop filled with PDF and Word documents related to your work, and the file accidentally gets emailed to someone who's not intended to receive it by another member of your household who shares that device with you. There are various facilities out there for you to create password protected folders, and I'd recommend you do that if you are using your own devices. I would also recommend using good quality internet security software. I'm sure if you're using an RSL issued device, that's already in place anyway. If you're using your own, then it's fundamentally important that you are using good quality software and that it's up to date as well, both in terms of the year. So having antivirus software from 2018 or 2019 would be fine, but running Norton 2006 would not be acceptable in this day and age. And having good quality firewalls there as well, ensuring that firewalls are enabled and not disabled. These are little things that you can do to just protect any interference or unauthorized access to your device. The next point is cybercrime and phishing. Unfortunately, the coronavirus COVID-19 has been used as an opportunity by cyber criminals to send scam emails, phishing emails to people who are desperate for information. We're all living in a time where we want to know more. People want to know when things are going to return to normal or what normal will look like, and any communication we can get is useful and valuable to us. And if we receive an email in our inbox that says that, let's say, we've been selected for the coronavirus vaccination or something similar, while that may seem in normal times, I suppose, something that's slightly outrageous and not something that we'd normally look at, in these times we may be more inclined to open these types of emails and to have a look at what's going on. Now, these emails may contain links to all sorts of websites that install weird and wonderful viruses and so forth on our devices. So just be aware of those. There's been a crackdown, certainly by the National Cybersecurity Centre. The Information Commissioner has also been warning about this too, and the regulator has also been in touch a number of times with you, certainly since the tail end of last year, and more so now with the coronavirus, to flag up that staff need to be very careful about these emails. Another thing is what happens if it goes wrong? Even if you take all these measures and you have the best data security possible, what happens if you experience a data security breach or an incident during the lockdown period? What are you to do? Are you aware of who you are to report this to? Is it your DPO? Is it someone else within your organisation? Are staff within your organisation aware of the fact that this is what they need to do if something happens? What if they lose a personal device? What if they go for their daily exercise or walk that they're allowed and lose a mobile phone that contains RSL information? Staff need to know who they need to report these things to, and it's very important that if you're not the DPO or you are the DPO for your organisation, that they know to come to you or to another person within your RSL. Once this is all over and we are hopefully back to a state of normality, whatever that may look like, one of the things that we will need to keep in mind is that data security just doesn't end there, that we need to be aware of what we do in the transition period from moving from working from home to being back in the office. There's going to be that transition period where we need to think about personal data cleanup of our devices. So if you've been using a personal device at home to work from home and you have all sorts of files on that device, think about how you migrate that to your document management system if you've not done that. And similarly, if you've been using a workspace laptop and for whatever reason you have made some personal use of it, then making sure that any personal information related to your personal life is removed from that device as well. Get involved in that personal data cleanup sooner rather than later, because then otherwise you may never get to it once we, as I say, get to that transition period. If there is a breach or an incident while we're in lockdown, unfortunately, the Information Commissioner's Office is still open for business when it comes to breaches. So we would need to think about how we go about reporting them in the usual way that we do. The Commissioner, though, has said that she will take an empathetic and a proportionate approach to breach reporting requirements, so that if an organisation is late or later than it would normally be in reporting the breach, or if it's slightly slow in terms of taking rectification steps, then the Commissioner is not going to be overly concerned by that. But it depends on the circumstances. By the end of the day, it's something that she's aware of the fact that coronavirus is here and organisations are impacted by it. So take some comfort from that. But at the same time, I cannot possibly condone taking 3 or 4 weeks to report something to the Commissioner that you should really be doing in 3 days as per the usual period. But there is a degree of leeway there. And if you are very, very unfortunate, which I would hope not, but if you are very unfortunate, you are landed with a monetary penalty notice, then the Commissioner has certainly said that she will take into account the overall economic impact of that fine on the organisation and the affordability of it, naturally because of finances that have been impacted across the board by the coronavirus. The last thing that I'd just like to spend a couple of minutes on is FOI and the Coronavirus Scotland Act 2002. I appreciate this is not related to the GDPR as such and the things we've discussed, but I thought it would only be useful just to mention it as a by the way. It's possibly a webinar in its own right, to be honest, but I'll just flag up some of the key points that you should be aware of here. The Coronavirus Scotland Act 2020 was quite possibly one of the fastest pieces of legislation that has moved through the Scottish Parliament in recent times, and rightly so, given the circumstances that we are currently in. Introduces a number of emergency changes to various pieces of legislation, and not least freedom of information. It takes the Freedom of Information in Scotland Act 2002 and makes certain changes that will apply until the 30th of September this year, and possibly longer, and the Scottish ministers have the power to increase the period for which it applies. What the legislation does is essentially 2 things. For FOISA requests, and only FOISA requests, it doesn't apply to requests under the Environmental Information Scotland regulations. It increases the maximum timescale that you have for response from 20 working days to 60 working days, both for responding to requests and also when responding to requests for review as well. But this does not take away, and the Scottish Information Commissioner here, the SIC, reminds us of this, it doesn't take you away from having to respond promptly where you can do so. We've certainly received a number of requests since lockdown, or our clients have received a number of requests since lockdown, and we haven't found it to be a particular issue, certainly, but I am aware that it could cause problems for RSLs where they don't have the same access to documents or office facilities. So the requirement to respond promptly is still there. The second change that it makes is that when an application is made to the Scottish Information Commissioner, so when a person has been to you, put the request in, they've asked you for a review, they're not satisfied with the outcome of the review, and they apply to the Commissioner for the Commissioner to look into your handling of the request and whether it complies with FOI legislation. One of the things that the Commissioner can take into account where you fail to respond within the 60 working days is the impact of the coronavirus on your organisation and your failure, but only where the Commissioner considers that the failure was reasonable in all of the circumstances. Now, it's quite a vague legal test, but based on what the Commissioner has said on his website, it looks as though they will be applying it fairly generously. So don't expect your fingers to be burned necessarily if you do find yourself in front of the Commissioner during this period or post period for something that happened during the lockdown period. One document that's very useful for you that's available for the SFHA is well, as well as the usual template letters, but the template letter for when the 20 or the 16 working day period could not be met. That was published by the SFHA and it's available for you to use if you're not able to meet it. In terms of your own record keeping, I would strongly recommend that if you're not able to deal with FOI requests within the 20 or the 60 working day period, keep records of why you were not able to do so. And it really does come down to staff being not available due to sickness, or your DPO not being available, or other key staff not being available, or staff who would typically be involved in dealing with FOI or helping with FOI requests being diverted from their usual jobs to doing other roles, and staff not having access to the same resources outside the office that they would normally have out with the office. Keep records of all of these things, so that if you are ever questioned on it, if you do find yourself subject to challenge in front of the Commissioner, as I say, that you do have the audit trail there to demonstrate that it was completely unavoidable for you to not comply with the request. The Commissioner, as well as giving all of this useful information on what the Coronavirus Scotland Act means in terms of deadlines for compliance, has also said that he recommends that requesters be slightly more sympathetic to organisations that are subject to FOI before they put a request in. So one of the things he suggested is to narrow requests. And if a requester hasn't done this, this is something that you can certainly do under the duty to provide advice and assistance. You can ask a person, a requester, to narrow their request if needs be to certainly help you out here. They're also recommended to look at the publication scheme. Your publication schemes are all still relatively up to date and new, and you should be updating them as you go along. So a lot of the information that people may be looking for will be within the scheme, and to direct them to that. And also to do some common sense things like submitting requests by email, because obviously not all RSLs necessarily have arrangements for checking post and faxes and so forth that are coming into the office. So email's the best bet to get someone to contact very quickly. Bear in mind that requesters still have a fairly strong position when it comes to you not responding to the requests quickly. So if you decide to take the 60 working days, and let's say for whatever reason you've not used the SFHA template letter, or if you have, you've not set out the reasons in full properly within that letter, they still have the ability to challenge you and to potentially come back for a review and say, well, you should have responded promptly. I don't believe you need the full 60 working days to respond. And they still have that avenue, but they should only really use that if there are genuine concerns around why you didn't respond. And bear in mind that your duty to publish still applies, and the Commissioner has recommended that RSLs could use this, or organisations generally could use this, to publish information about how they responded to the coronavirus, what sorts of measures they put into place, and so forth. And certainly that's been done very positively by RSLs, as to looking at your websites generally. You have set out a lot of information around how you're continuing your service provision in the face of the current circumstances. And the last thing that I'd just like to mention is around the stat returns. You'll be aware that for those of you who are involved in completing these for your RSL, the second of your stat returns is due by the 8th of May. The Commissioner, again, has been very sympathetic here, and what he has said is that he will allow for delays so that you don't need to submit the stat return on the 8th of May if there are circumstances that are impacting on your ability to do so. And in any case, he's willing to accept the two submissions for this one, the second return and the third return, which is due on the 7th of August at the same time. So you could do two at that time. I suspect, based on what the way things are looking right now, there may be further extensions available here as well. But bear in mind, you should be keeping, or your DPO should be keeping, records of all the requests that you've received anyway. So completing the stats return, if you've got these records to hand, shouldn't be too difficult for you within the timescales. Okay, that was all I wanted to say on data sharing, data security, and FOI. I hope you found the webinar useful, and if there's any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them just now.
Thanks, Daradjeet. We've got some questions just to finish off. First of all, what's your view on using Zoom? And this is particularly in light of the recent security issues that have been highlighted.
I'll be honest, and this is me being slightly biased, but I'm not a big fan of Zoom. I know all video conferencing platforms have their shortcomings, but I just feel that based on what has been said in the media, not through my own personal use, I've not touched the app to be honest, but based on what's been said in the media, I would not recommend using it. I would suggest that you think about other alternatives, but I would keep your keep an eye on what's going on, because I know Zoom behind the scenes is doing a lot. They've not done enough, I think, so far. There's still some way that they can go. But I think it certainly it will become a viable platform, but only once they've fixed the concerns. But I know that staff do use Zoom within RSLs to catch up with one another. And my advice has been in those scenarios is to say that if you are using it as an informal tool to sort of have a team catch up, then what to do is email an agenda, to a very rough and ready agenda of item 1, item 2, item 3, so forth, to your colleagues. And if you're discussing them, just refer to them by agenda item. So let's say the one member of staff would say, so what do you think about item 1? And the other would just come back with their comments on the Zoom call, but without delving into the specifics. So my recommendation would be, if you can avoid it, fantastic. If you can't, then use an alternative means like that.
Thanks,
sorry, Daradjeet and Alan, can I just come in there, because I know it's Karen here from the events team. We're using Zoom for a number of our webinars, and I do think that it's worth differentiating very much between the meetings aspect of it, where I think there's been a lot of security issues, and the webinar side. Our webinar side is password protected, and there's a number of levels of security that we're able to offer. So when people log in, the information's not widely available, so we're able to, as much as we can on any platform, stop Zoom bombing, which I think is the phrase. That's a new phrase for us all. Yes. And so what it's been able to do with us, and one of the reasons that we're using it is we've found limitations for a number of organisations who maybe aren't using Teams and being able to access, which is why at the moment we're probably using both. So we're using Teams for today's webinar, this afternoon's webinars on Zoom, but we're very aware of the security issues, and I think having everything password protected, not using generated IDs, much the same as you mentioned with your router, you know, having all of these extra layers of security in any of the platforms that you're using, I think is something that we're looking at. And Gary's also looking, our digital lead is looking at perhaps putting some advice together in some work that he's doing with the SCVO, getting advice from the cybersecurity. So I hope you don't mind me jumping in. I thought it was just worth mentioning. Lovely. Okay, I'll mute myself now, Alan, over to you.
Thanks for that, Karen, much appreciated. The next question is what sort of things could be included in a basic risk assessment that could be used to check what IT systems and security staff at home have? And this is to ensure that data is as secure as it can be. And this is keeping in mind that people aren't IT experts as well, I think is a good point.
That's a very good question. I think it's something that that staff certainly, there could be almost like a mini audit. I wouldn't want to use the audit word, because then that can strike the fear of God into a lot of people. But certainly you could ask questions around staff around, well, what sort of devices are you using? Are they shared by other people? Are they password protected? Do you have a home Wi-Fi connection? Have you changed the password? It would be taking the effective risk management tips that I've highlighted and turning them into questions, but questions that are more user friendly. So to ask them ask staff what sorts of apps they use to help them with their job, for example. So you're not presenting it almost as a data security checklist, but it's more just a questionnaire to get a feel for how staff are working from home. And that would then give you, I feel, the toolkit then to be able to go back to say, well, okay, we need to hone in on a particular issue because staff are, let's say, using WhatsApp to share confidential files from mobile devices. That's something we need to crack down upon. Or it may be that you come back and your staff are very data protection aware and they're doing what they need to do. So that'd be a very useful exercise, I think, certainly given that the lockdown has been extended, and given that we do have a bit more time now to do this, whereas 3 or 4 weeks ago when we started the lockdown, we didn't have the same opportunities. A lot of RSLs I know were just rushing to embrace remote working, which was quite a strange concept for a lot of them. So worthwhile to do, I think.
Thanks, Daradjeet. And one final question. Are you aware of an increase in the reporting of data protection incidents or breaches due to home working? And do you have any examples that maybe we could learn from?
I'll be honest, I haven't had, touch wood, I haven't had any in my capacity either as advisor or DPO to RSLs. I haven't had any incidents or breaches reported to me. Now, that's not to say that they're not happening. Maybe staff aren't reporting them to me. I would hope they are telling me if something happens. But my advice would be is to just make staff aware of the sorts of do's and don'ts of home working. There's very valuable employee-friendly layperson type drafted documents on the National Cybersecurity Centre's website that you can share with your staff. They're tips for remote working or home working, and certainly that will keep them alive to the issues. But yeah, there are certain breaches that just need to be aware of, the likes of shared devices or letting people look at documents, or maybe working in a common space within the household where others can see things. Just being alive to the risks, I think, more than anything else.
Great, okay, well, all that remains to be said now is thanks to everyone for being a part of this webinar, and a special thanks to Daradjeet. A recording of the session will be available on the SFHA website, and please get in touch if you have any further queries. Thanks again.
Thank you.